Good afternoon. Welcome to Utah State's LAP Speaker Series, where we get to host remarkable people in and adjacent to the professions of landscape architecture and environmental planning. My name is Addison Martin, and I'm the Graduate Student Speaker Series Coordinator, joined by Alana Nafziger this semester. She'll be taking over for me. This is actually my last Speaker Series giving the intro, and she'll just take it from here. Today we get to enjoy some hot chocolate and donuts while listening to our speaker, and then we'll have a brief Q&A since we're already here in this common studio. To get attendance credit, you may sign into the Slido after the Q&A, and we will go over that then. We would like to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the Utah State University campuses and centers reside and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah. The Logan campus is situated in the Sahiva-Goy, or Willow Valley, the ancestral lands of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, where Shoshone people have stewarded the land since time immemorial and continue to do today. We acknowledge these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We affirm indigenous self-governance history, experiences, and the resiliency of the Native people who are still here today. Today, we have the honor of hearing from our distinguished alumni, Sarah Creachbaum. She's the Regional Director for the National Park Service in Alaska. Sarah's dedication to conservation spans over 3 decades, beginning with her role as a National Park Superintendent in 2006, and has taken her all across the world, from Norway to Indonesia. Notably, Sarah has led the monumental Elwha River Restoration Project, a groundbreaking endeavor that marks the largest dam removal and river restoration effort in the United States. Sarah's leadership has been instrumental in shaping the conservation landscape, from Guam's War in the Pacific National Historic Park to a national park in Hawaii and Washington's Olympic National Park. In addition to her park assignments, Sarah has held temporary roles such as Superintendent of the Grand Canyon, as well as Acting Deputy Regional Director for the Pacific West Region and Senior Advisor for the Alaska Region of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Arizona and a Master of Landscape Architecture from here at Utah State University, graduating in 1995. Sarah's professional achievements include graduating from the Senior Executive Service Candidate Development Program in 2017 and completing training with the Federal Executive Institute, as well as serving as the chairperson for the NPS National Wilderness Stewardship Council. She has also been honored with the NPS Bevinetto Fellowship for her efforts in fostering cooperation between the National Park Service and Congress. Residing in the heart of Alaska in Anchorage, Sarah's commitment to environmental stewardship remains unwavering. Today, we're immensely grateful to have technology bridge this gap and allowing us to connect with Sarah virtually and glean insights from her wealth of experience. Please join me in extending a warm and long-awaited welcome to Sarah Creachbaum.
I'm very excited to speak with all of you. I'm going to move this slide on to the very first jazzy slide that was provided for me. My name is Sarah Creachbaum, and I am currently the Regional Director for the National Park Service in the Alaska region. There's the jazzy slide. If all of you come to work for the National Park Service, I'm afraid you'll have to say goodbye to jazzy slides. We don't do jazzy slides in the federal government very often, but we do colorful slides, so this is my first. So good afternoon again to everyone. I am speaking to you from Anchorage, Alaska. I'm in downtown Anchorage currently, where it's snowing like crazy. And where I am sitting is the traditional lands of the Dana Ina, and they've lived here for time immemorial. But we will be talking a lot about Native Alaskans in this presentation. And so you'll see that a tiny little spot represents one of many, many, many different people. So these are my presentation objectives. I wish, what I want to do is turn this darn thing off and just talk with all of you. because I'm really interested in what you all think about the world today. It's a very different world than what I experienced in 1995. I hope there are fewer sleepless nights in the graduate program than what I experienced. Hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. But I know it's Friday afternoon, and the first thing I don't want to do to a bunch of my fellow USU students is to be boring. And then secondly, it's kind of an ulterior motive for this presentation. I would absolutely love to lure you all into considering a career with the National Park Service. I personally have found my career to be phenomenal, very rewarding, very difficult. But I also think that it's very well suited. The National Park Service, particularly leadership and management positions in the National Park Service, are particularly well suited to landscape architects. And I think that that will be revealed a little bit through my presentation. So I'm just going to talk with you about some of the things that I do on a daily basis. So a couple of important management topics, and one particularly that's influenced by climate change and subsistence resources in Alaska. And then again, I don't want to be boring, so I'm going to move on. Sorry, I'm not very well not used to Zoom. We use Teams in the federal government. So there we go. I'll try to get smoother. So this slide is of the United States. This slide's taken from a school book. It's the slide I grew up with, and it's typical with tiny little Alaska down in the corner. And a friend of mine who happens to be an Inupiat woman describes this as cartographic gaslighting, which is a term I really liked, because really, this is the way it should be. So Alaska is enormous, 665,000 square miles. And if it was a country, it would be the 17th largest in the world. And if you can think about the distance between Denver to Mexico City, from the north to the very tip of the south, that's about the distance. So our Alaska National Parks that I'm going to be talking about today cover about 54 million acres and consist and make up of more than 2/3 of all the national parklands in the country. And I've just put this slide in for fun because I just wanted to show you all that Alaska's a lot bigger than Utah. Little bragging right there. And give you a basic orientation to the national parks in Alaska. Like I said, it's 2/3 of all the land that is managed by the National Park Service in the country. And here's a map that I think is important as a way of introduction to some of the topics we're going to be talking about, to all of the Alaska Native tribes in the state. And I am responsible for all of those parklands for 54 million acres within the state of consulting and working very closely with, and in many cases, co-stewarding and co-managing parklands with many, many, many of these tribes. And it takes up the majority of my workday. I can't really talk much about Alaska or national parklands without giving you just a brief primer on ANILCA. That's the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. It was passed in 1980, and it's the reason that we have most of the national parks that we do in Alaska. It was somewhat of a grand compromise in allowing some Alaska Natives to develop corporations, to also have a different government-to-government relationship with the United States. And one of the most important things that ANILCA did was establish protections for subsistence lifestyles in the state. And that's under, if you live in Alaska for very long, you learn to recite Section 804 because it's so important to us. The majority of Alaskans live in Anchorage. Our state population is about 700,000, but approximately 120,000 people live off the land. And this law was passed to protect not only their lifestyle, but their lifeway. Many of the people in Alaska who live off of subsistence, off of the land, are Alaska natives, but not all. Some rural residents also subsist off the land. And the language is almost as eloquent, I think, as the National Park Service Organic Act, which requires me to protect unimpaired all of the lands that I manage for future generations. But this also, NILCA also requires me as a land manager to care for the lifeway, the lifestyle of the people who live off the land within Alaska. And so you may ask me, because climate change was in the title, what has that got to do with climate change in Alaska's national parks? Well, climate change actually permeates everything these days, so it's not so surprising. But most of what I do has to do with dealing with subsistence resources and protecting the lifeways of Alaska Native people in the state has a lot to do with the effects of climate change. And the National Park Service, like all federal agencies, I think you guys must these days be really well informed on climate change and different models for planning and scenario planning and vulnerability analysis. And I'd really like to talk about that later. I'd like to know what you're learning in class. But the Park Service has oodles of different types of scenarios, and every park usually has done a scenario planning and a vulnerability analysis and has defined some adaptation processes. Most of the parks, though, in the lower 48, a lot of their adaptation strategies deal with facilities. And because of the unique breadth and magnitude of the landscapes in Alaska, our work in climate change adaptation and planning is totally different than anywhere else. National Park Service just published, so it's got a 23 date on it, but it really just came off the presses on our climate change strategy. And really a lot of it has to do with mitigating and communicating with masses of visitors. And we don't have masses of visitors here in Alaska. We do have quite a few, but we don't have the numbers that are being experienced in the 48. What we have here is landscape, and the landscape is telling us some very troubling things. One of the things that I found most startling when you picture Alaska, you picture that map that I showed you, when you look at the Arctic, all across the northern part of the world is tundra and permafrost. And it's essentially frozen land. And as the Earth is warming, the Earth in the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than any place else on the planet. And as the permafrost melts, it becomes permeable, like all other land. And as soon as that happens, lakes start to drain. Crazy, isn't it, to think of all of that landscape out there with all of these lakes in the tundra. And as the permafrost underneath it melts, the lakes are draining. And you are all brilliant landscape architect students. So I don't need to tell you to imagine what that's going to look like to wildlife species, to greenhouse gases, carbon sequestration, all of those really important things that drive climate change are really being driven by this massive landscape that's melting. I hope you guys can see this video. I can see the video. It's of a time lapse over a couple of months of a roadbed in Denali National Park that is actually sort of a permafrost river that is melting between two peaks. And the time lapse that you're seeing here is that movement is over just a few months. And many of you who read the news might know that, unfortunately, that little bit of melting landscape that you can see better in this photo happened to be on the Denali Park Road, which is one of the most important throughways of Denali National Park. And it's really an important to our park visitors, because there aren't very many places in Alaska where a visitor can actually access wilderness and the magnitude that we have here in Alaska. And this roadway, of course, that it's only you can only access this area by reserving a ride on a bus, so it's all mass transit. And this slide actually cut off transportation about halfway up the park road, which is about 54 miles. The other really important thing to consider, I put this in there for all of you construction geeks. There were a couple in my class, so I thought maybe you'd like to see this. But so it's really interesting to try to build a bridge 54 miles into Alaskan wilderness that across this melting sort of ice cream sandwich where the middle is melting out and the two sides of the cliff face are intact. And so there's like tons of excavation, 80,000 cubic yards of dirt being moved around, and lots of really cool technology. But that would be a whole different slideshow. But if you invite me back, I'll be happy to talk with you about the Pretty Rocks Bridge. Pretty amazing. Oh, the thermosiphons. Before I move on, so the bridge is planted on either side using thermosiphons. It's not new technology. They used it on the Alaska pipeline, but it essentially keeps the ground frozen by siphoning air and cold air back through the system to keep the ground frozen underneath the bridge foundation. Oops. Of course, climate change is also affecting park visitation and the fun things that visitors expect to do in our national parks. And it also is affecting our glaciers in a big way. You can see the warming of and the melting of the glaciers here at the Exit Glacier, which is down in Kenai Fjords and is accessible pretty much by roadway. So it's a very popular stop by our visitors, but now they have to hike a long, long way to get to the glacier terminus. And of course, fire. The fire that happens now that the landscape is warming on a landscape of the magnitude that we're discussing here, both lends to terrible air quality, such as we experienced with the fires in Canada last year. That they are so large that generally we don't have the resources and the people and the time to fight these fires, of course, unless they come close to a community. So I wanted again to remind you before we go into the next session talking about subsistence resources and something that's very important to me, the size of Alaska and the magnitude and the number of acres that are managed in Alaska's national park. because it has a lot to do with why all of this is so important. Oh, and then again, I just wanted to remind you all how tiny Utah is compared to Alaska. I can't see you. I hope at least somebody's smiling. Maybe not. Well, all of those landscape changes are affecting, of course, the wildlife. As the climate is warming, the climate is changing, and it's affecting our wildlife in drastic ways. The Western Arctic caribou herd used to be numbered in the 600,000s. It was one of the largest mammal migrations in the world, along with the porcupine caribou herd. With climate warming, with rain on snow events, the caribou herd has crashed in Alaska, and it's gone from 600,000 to less than 200,000 now. And there's real concern as to whether the caribou herds will ever be able to restore themselves. And they are extremely important to Native Alaskans. As the climate warms also, ice is melting. Doesn't take a stretch of the imagination for that. A couple of the things that are really important about melting ice, of course, is that in the winter, of which it's winter a lot in the Arctic, those frozen roads are transportation routes and very important to the people who live there. There's very few roads in Alaska. Maybe you don't know this, so I'll fill you in. I just looked it up. So in Utah, there's 3,500,000 and change miles of municipal highways in Utah, and there's less than 13,000 miles of municipal roads and highways in the entire state of Alaska. So most of it's roadless, and during the winter, if it doesn't freeze, people can't get to where they need to get. And a lot of that has to do with food. One of the things that's deeply troubling is the melting of the snow ice off the coast of Alaska. And many of the people who live in the Northwest rely on seal, and they are not able now to go out onto the ice in the winter because it's unsafe. Usually snowmobile out to hunt seal. It's really important to their culture. Particularly important is teaching their children their life ways. And now they're facing a future where they can't teach their kiddos their traditional ways of life. The salmon population in Alaska is also not in good shape. And our people in Alaska rely on the salmon as they do on the caribou for their subsistence. Most Alaskans do some sort of subsistence harvest, but more than a third of all Alaskans usually have about 60% of their food comes from not a grocery store, but what they hunt and gather on the landscape. They don't have grocery stores in most of the villages, or if they do have a grocery store, you're not making it up. You're going to pay $20 for a small box of crackers. The cost of food in a grocery store is extraordinary. And if you go to Costco in Anchorage, you also have to pay the shipping fees, which are extraordinarily expensive as well. Salmon, it's hard to underestimate the importance of both salmon and caribou to the people of Alaska. It's part of their heart. They are physically ill when they can't harvest salmon and when they can't harvest caribou. It's really central to everything they do. I really want a fish camp Barbie. And one of the most important things, as I mentioned with the melting sea ice, is that people aren't able to teach their children their traditional life ways. Hunting and gathering in Alaska is an extraordinarily important part of their culture, what makes them happy and why they live here. So I'm getting kind of close here to wrapping it up, and I wanted to share with you a few thoughts about why all this is so important to me. As the regional director of the Alaska region, I serve on the Federal Subsistence Board, and that is made up of the regional directors of the BLM, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we have 3 public members. And together we receive input from small local regional advisory councils on the management of subsistence resources for over 64 million acres of federal land. It's really a heady responsibility because as a National Park Service regional director in the lower 48, I was somewhat of a zealot about protecting landscapes and wilderness. The whole untrammeled by man guided my work ethic. And living and working in Alaska in the face of climate change, it becomes very clear that those things that you want so desperately to protect, those wild landscapes, don't mean anything when people are hungry. And I think that that's one of the greatest lessons of climate change and protection of landscapes, and particularly national parks in general. It's not going to be possible to protect those lands unimpaired for future generations. And indeed, some of those lands may be needed to feed future generations. And not just future generations of people, future generations of wildlife. Our wildlife is hungry too. Both bears and wolves rely on salmon fisheries. They rely on caribou, and they rely on berries, and they rely on moose. And if those resources are in such rapid decline, they aren't going to be fed either. And the scary part about this is, of course, that the first thing that people move to when their caribou or their salmon are in short supply is the killing of predators. And we may have to have a discussion about predator control. I know that there are many people out there who certainly believe that that helps in the recovery of wildlife species, but in the National Park Service, we don't do predator control, and most of our science indicates that it doesn't work so well. And actually letting the species become resilient and do what they do on the landscape makes all species healthier. And I threw in these slides at the end because I really wanted to, well, I wanted to say that these are all matters of the heart. And that's why I think landscape architects are so good in the National Park Service. Good at understanding the connection that people have with their landscapes, the heart and spiritual connection that people have with landscapes and with wildlife, the importance that it's there, even though you may never see it, the importance of caring for it, and that it matters, and that not just the wildlife, but that these landscapes matter. And so that's why it's really important for us all to do the best work that we possibly can. It's important for us to collect the best science, the most careful science that we can do on the natural world and on our landscapes and on ecosystems. It's important for us to absorb and learn and capture all the indigenous knowledge that we can from people who have lived on these landscapes for thousands and thousands of years. They have so much to tell us. And that's why I want you to come work for the National Park Service. That's the end. Hi, Michael Timmons.
Voice from the distant past, and it's so wonderful to see what you're doing and hear about all your accomplishments. I have a question. I've been retired for, gosh, 9 years now, and when I retired, going back to the time when you were a student, it was very difficult to get a job with the National Park Service. And I know you're encouraging everyone to get jobs with the service, but what are the prospects now for students who are graduating? Back 10, 20 years ago, the Park Service seemed to be downsizing markedly, and it was just extremely difficult to get in the loop. Has that changed?
Yes and no. These days, we're finding it difficult to get interest from younger students in living in more remote places. And I think a lot of, I think it comes down to a lack of an understanding about how to play the federal system and to actually what it takes to get a job in the federal system. And it doesn't take, and I'm not saying skills, I'm saying simply filling out the dang paperwork. And we're really finding that that when we can connect with students and help them navigate that.
Can you hear this?
I can.
Okay, we're having sound issues on our end.
Okay.
Oh. Well, sorry, Sarah, maybe you can continue.
Okay. Yeah, so the Park Service has work to do in outreach and recruitment because the jobs are there. It takes some tenacity to get them.
I'm hoping everybody sitting in the auditorium can hear that, because it is, we've had so many alumni from the program over the years go to work with the Park Service, and I know it takes tenacity and
Michael,
whatever. Yeah.
we lost the sound for a little while. Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
Oh, so people there couldn't hear what
Now
we were
that
talking
everybody
about.
can hear.
Okay, I had initially asked Sarah what the prospects were for students getting employment with the Park Service, because from the time I retired, going backwards 20 years or so, it was very difficult. The Park Service seemed to be downsizing, and although many of our graduates wanted to work for the Park Service, it was extremely difficult to get on board, and you had to play games with getting unpaid internships for 6 months or a year or something just to get your foot in the door. And I was just wondering how that might have changed and what advice Sarah might have for folks that are graduating that do want to go to work for Sarah.
And I was mentioning to Mike that it has always been a paperwork nightmare to get into the service. And it is oftentimes necessary, especially I found as a landscape architect, that it was important for me to do a couple of years of rangering, seasonal type work in the Park Service before I got a full-time professional landscape job in landscape architecture and that was with the Forest Service. I think we need to do a better job as a service, as a Park Service, in mentoring and bringing students into federal service. It's not as if we have millions of jobs out there, and I wouldn't want to convey that, but I think we have some good jobs for people who are particularly interested in environmental planning and in landscape architecture. And I mean, I would personally like to help.
Thank you. We have a question here in the audience, and then we'll move on to some of the online questions.
So you talked about how in the lower 48, a lot of climate mitigation is done through visitor awareness and education. How is that different in Alaska where you don't have the same amount of visitors?
That's a really great question. And the answer has a lot to do with prioritizing your work as a professional, and only having so many hours in the day to get your work done. We have professionals who do climate change messaging, but the majority of my work, unlike in the lower 48, is actually dealing with helping people get food. Does that make sense? I would, as an add-on to that, I'd very much like to take some of these messages that are being learned in Alaska and convey them to park visitors in the lower 48, because I think the same problems that we're experiencing about food security and landscape loss and ecosystem decline, wildlife decline on a large scale may soon be experienced in the lower 48, and perhaps by learning from some of our lessons, both of what not to do, and then the resilience of the people and their ability to adapt to the changing climate situations, could be a really great message. It'd be really helpful.
Awesome. Okay. One of the questions from the chat is, what other degree paths would aid in getting a position in National Park Service aside from landscape architecture?
That's the cool part about the National Park Service. We have lots of different types of professions who work for us, everything from being an engineer and designing cool things like the bridge in Denali at Polycrow on Pretty Rocks Road, to historians, landscape historians, historians in landscape architecture, cultural folks who manage cultural landscapes, anthropologists, archaeologists, biologists, ecologists, administrative people, maintenance people, and folks who are particularly interested in leadership.
Cool. Do we have any other questions in here? Okay, we have one more question for you, Sarah.
Is it on right now? Okay. Sarah, you talked a lot about people practicing subsistently in Alaska. And so I'm wondering how many people there like do their own fishing and subsistence agriculture type stuff as opposed to people that just go buy their groceries from the store.
Right. Good. That's a great question. So the population of Alaska is about 700,000. And you know, numbers vary, but it's estimated that people who live off the land and are live by subsistence are about between 120 and 140,000. Some rural and others Native Alaskan. And I think we would have a lot more subsistence users, like all, shoot, just it's been the way of the world. You know, kiddos can't make a living in their little village anymore. And with subsistence resources like caribou and salmon crashing, they have to move to the cities to survive.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause for Sarah Creachbaum. Hopefully you heard that this time.
I did.
Slido is now open, and the code this time is scenario B. SCENARIO space B. Great. In 2 weeks, we will we'll be back in the primary auditorium where speaker series is normally held, and we will be hearing from Chris Creasy. But yes, thank you so much for coming here and hearing from Sarah Creachbaum.